The gradual disintegration of the Romans' ability to control its own territory and protect its interests during the mid-3rd century AD was as spectacular in its scope as it was unprecedented in its form. That's not to say that rebellions never happened in Roman history before this period. As you might imagine, in a time before instant communication, and in an empire as expansive as Rome, it would be natural for rebellions to crop up from time to time. Miscommunication, delays in the spread of information, and plain old bad luck conspired to cause political crisis in previous centuries. For example, in 175 AD, when Marcus Aurelius was bedridden with a serious illness, the news that left the emperor's camp was not that he was gravely ill, but that he had already died. This report made its way from the Rhine frontier all the way to Egypt, where one of Marcus's top generals, a man named Avidius Cassius, declared himself emperor. A few sources blame the miscommunication on Marcus's wife Faustina. They claim that Faustina, wanting to retain her position as the Augusta, and to ensure that her son Commodus would eventually inherit the throne, sent word to Avidius Cassius, telling the general that should anything happen to Marcus, he should quickly declare the empire for himself and marry her to ensure his own legitimacy. Therefore, when the false report reached Avidius Cassius, he followed the empress's instructions and made a play for the throne. The same sources also tell us that Marcus, when he eventually did recover his health, was not moved to anger over this episode. He instead wished no harm to come to Avidius Cassius, either by his own hand or at the hands of anyone else, since he wished to show mercy to the usurper. Avidius Cassius would live long enough to realize the horrible truth, that the emperor was not in fact on death's door, and that he had rebelled in error. But once he was made aware of these facts, he continued his rebellion, despite the fact that neither he nor the emperor wanted to. You see, by the twisted logic of zero-sum politics, if one declares openly that they're rebelling against the absolute monarch, it means death for the rebel if the rebellion is to fail. Literally, the only thing that can save the rebel is success. The accidental rebellion wasn't the only kind that the Romans had ever experienced. The Roman Principate, that system of Roman governance headed by a king cloaked in republican imagery and title, was founded via rebellion. The rebellion of Julius Caesar against the legitimate authority of the Roman Senate and consuls was what finally destroyed the government. Augustus Caesar, Julius's adopted heir and successor, in turn rebelled against the wishes of the Senate when he instituted the Principate. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that Augustus took extraordinary measures to prevent further rebellions against his authority from the very beginning. Chief in his plan was to have personal and unambiguous control over as much of the Roman military as he possibly could. He was careful to disarm the Senate so that it could never pose a real military threat again, as it had during his own rebellion and the rebellion of Julius Caesar before him. Furthermore, he instituted laws that gave him control over the legions stationed in whichever province he stepped into, so that wherever he was, he would be the de facto commander-in-chief of the army. This system worked as long as Augustus was alive. But upon his death, a full 150 years before the rebellion of Maximinus, his successor Tiberius was almost immediately faced with a mutiny of a significant portion of the Roman army. Tacitus tells us that the troops had been given a rest from military discipline when news of the death of Augustus had come to the military bases of Pannonia, or modern-day Austria. The men were stirred to rebellion by a former actor in their ranks, since he had ample training in how to stir up a crowd. This actor used his talents in hopes of extracting as much money from the situation as possible. He argued that it was monstrously unfair that the legionaries risked their lives in freezing cold and hostile territory of the Danube, when the lands that were promised to them for a lifetime of service were located in barren mountain ranges and muddy swamps. What Tacitus does not tell us, but surely must have been a case, is that while these soldiers were loyal to Augustus, they had very little reason to continue to be loyal to Tiberius. The army, as an institution, had shifted away from its original role as a communal instrument of the Senate to one whose loyalties lie with its direct commanders. Soldiers looked to their generals for payment, not to the government. In this version of the Roman army, when the commander died, the contract between soldier and patron was if not null and void, at least up for serious reconsideration. In the case of Augustus's former legions on the Danube border, their demands were surprisingly reasonable. They wanted their base pay raised from 10 asses per day to 16, and they wanted their retirement guaranteed after 16 years' service. Reasonable demands or not, they had in fact rebelled against their commanding officer, and in turn, the Emperor of the Romans. With this first rebellion, a kind of fever seemed to be spreading throughout the ranks. Not far away, in the newly minted provinces of Germania, an almost identical rebellion to the one I've just described occurred at nearly the same time. Tiberius, in response to these twin rebellions on the border, sent his 2 sons to put them down. Tacitus tells us about Tiberius's decision. Multa quipe et diversa angebant, validior per Germaniam troubled him. The army in Germany was the stronger, that in Pannonia the nearer. The first was supported by all the strength of Gaul, the latter menaced Italy. Which was he to prefer, without the fear that those whom he slighted would be infuriated by the affront? But his sons might alike visit both, and not compromise the imperial dignity, which inspired the greatest awe at a distance. There was also an excuse for mere youths referring some matters to their father, with the possibility that he could conciliate or crush those who resisted Germanicus or Drusus. What recourse remained if the soldiers despised the emperor? Germanico aut Druso posse a se mitigare vel infringi. Germanicus, the emperor's son, was eventually able to re-establish imperial control only after receiving oaths of loyalty from select military units in and around the rebellion in Germania. He then sent a letter to the rebelling legions commanding them to mete out military justice to the rebels, or face a general destruction of the legion when they are eventually opposed and defeated by overwhelming military force. The rebellion of Maximinus Thrax was nearly a perfect mixture of both accident and legitimate complaint from inside the legions. If you'll remember from last time, Maximinus's first order of business was to acquiesce to his new army's demands. They wanted war with the Germans that had devastated their lands, and they wanted compensation. Maximinus obliged his troops and led them over the Rhine River, sacking and burning every German town for the next 50 miles. This, he thought, would satisfy the troops' desire for plunder and for revenge. He ordered paintings be made of his daring do and sent them back to the capital to be displayed just in front of the Curia, or the Senate House, so that everyone could see as well as hear about how well the war was going. But the senators in the capital didn't care about Maximinus's bravery in battle. They were horrified to know that someone of his station had taken up the purple, and that he wanted money from them. Senatorial resistance to the coup of Maximinus began almost immediately after his rebellion. Maximinus himself seemed to sense that there was still quite a bit of loyalty to the now deceased Alexander, even after dismissing or executing several of the former emperor's advisors. His suspicions were confirmed when Maximinus resolved to cross the Rhine. He had a bridge constructed over the river. Gordian tells us what happened next. Magnus, tisonomaen ton epatridon in consular rank, named Magnus, was accused of organizing a conspiracy against the emperor and persuading some of the soldiers to transfer the empire to his charge. The plot was said to be something like this. Maximinus had bridged the Rhine River and was about to cross over and attack the Germans. Magnus, however, was said to have persuaded a few prominent soldiers, particularly those assigned to guard and maintain the bridge, to destroy the structure after Maximinus had crossed, and to betray the emperor to the barbarians by cutting off his only return route. After the bridge had been destroyed, the great river, very wide and deep, would be impassable, as no boats were available on the enemy's side. Such was the report of the plot, but whether it was actually true or whether it was fabricated by Maximinus is not easy to say, because the matter was not investigated. Maximinus did not bring the conspirators to trial or allow them an opportunity to defend themselves. He arrested without warning all who were suspected and executed them without mercy. The Historia Augusta tells us that Maximinus executed 4,000 soldiers in this episode, which must be an exaggeration. Maximinus was struggling to maintain his legitimacy and the loyalty of the army, and executing a large chunk of it would have certainly lost him both. He meant to double their pay and give each man in the army a donative, or personal gift from the newly minted emperor to his troops. As for where the money would come from, his solution was to use whatever public money that he knew was stored in the capital. He ordered all this public money to be brought up to the frontier, which meant defunding public festivals, the usual grain dole at Rome, and even stripping the temples to the deified emperors. And in this one act, the emperor alienated the aristocracy, the people, and the provinces. While Maximinus struggled against the Germans, a fresh revolt had broken out in Africa. This episode began thanks to a dispute over taxes owed by the sons of wealthy landholders and the imperial procurator of Africa. The office of procurator was a position in the provincial government responsible for collecting taxes, running local mints, and in places like Italy, arranging for grain shipments into the province. While the office of procurator was not nearly as prestigious as that of governor or consul, it did carry enormous financial rewards and judicial authority within that province. This particular procurator was known to hand down very harsh penalties and was nakedly corrupt. In the best of times, the office of procurator was a magnet for corruption. But now that the emperor was short on cash, the young men were resolved to get their money back. Gordian tells us, "Keleusi nuctor katelthin tu secton agron nenaniskos, xula tecai pelikes field laborers to come into the city at night armed with clubs and axes. Obeying their master's orders, the workmen entered the city in a body before daybreak, carrying arms for hand-to-hand fighting hidden under their clothes. A large number assembled, for Africa, which is a heavily populated province, has many farmers. When dawn was approaching, the youths appeared and ordered the mob of workmen to follow them, as if they were simply part of the crowd. They directed the workmen to take their assigned positions and, keeping their weapons hidden, to resist bravely if any of the soldiers or people should attack them to avenge the deed they were plotting. Carrying daggers under their robes, the youths approached the procurator as if to discuss the payment of the money. Then, attacking him suddenly, they stabbed and killed him. When the bodyguards drew their swords in retaliation, the workmen from the fields pulled out their clubs and axes and, fighting for their masters, easily routed their opponents. Now, an act of rebellion as severe as this one was just like the rebellion of Maximinus Thrax, in that from the moment it had started, there were only two options: success or death. The youths decided that the only way to save their skin from the dire consequences that follow violence against the Roman state was to hail the governor of the province as emperor and make sure that he accepts the acclamation. The governor of Africa, a man named Gordian, was 80 years old at the time. He had spent a lifetime in the civil service, having governed multiple other provinces and risen to the highest offices in the empire. The youths believed that Gordian would be honored, since he had worked so long in the civil service, that he finally be admitted to the ultimate office, and that he himself had been complaining about the empire's most recent barbarian ruler, from his unreasonable financial demands to the rude quality of his birth. So it came as quite a shock to the youths that the old man didn't immediately accept. In fact, he refused with tears in his eyes and begged the mob not to make him serve. But make him they did. Next time, we'll follow the natural consequences of this rebellion within a rebellion and see who will survive and who will fall. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. If you enjoy content like this, please like and subscribe. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.